we will kick off. So just to introduce myself, I'm Bruce Beams. I'm the president of the Vancouver Island section of the Canadian Institute of Transportation Engineers, who is hosting this webinar today. And just for a bit of housekeeping to start off, that we are recording this session. So your attendance is by default, assuming your acknowledgement that the recording is taking place. Today, Todd Litman will be presenting his latest book about transportation technologies, scooters, autonomous vehicles, flying taxis, and I don't know what other sort of vehicles and modes of transportation he might have up his sleeve that he wants to chat about, but he will tell us all about it. For those of you that don't know Todd, he had a brief bio in the introduction. Founder and executive director of the Victoria Transport Policy Institute, and he's also vice president of the ITE Vancouver Island section. So without further talking, I will pass it over to Todd. And just the last thing, if you have any questions, you can put them in the chat box, and I'll just monitor that as we go through the talk, and I'll raise the questions to Todd as the time seems appropriate. So Todd, over to you.
Thank you very much, Bruce. Greetings and best wishes to all of my friends participating in this webinar. Today, I'm going to be talking about my new book, New Mobilities, Smart Planning for Emerging Transportation Technologies. And this is a fun subject, and I hope we have a fun time. Okay. So, as I mentioned, New Mobilities, published by Planners Press this year. You can order a copy from not Planners Press, Island Press, and if you put the word webinar in the discount code box, you get 30% off. So this is about new technologies, new transportation technologies and services. It's fun to start by going back to some of our previous predictions about what new transportation technologies and services would look like. And so I like to go back to magazines like Popular Science and Popular Mechanics. And more than half of the covers of these magazines and many of the articles were about transportation technologies. Transportation technologies are often the way that people interact with emerging technological innovations, things like stronger metals and more efficient engines, and now electric motors and computers and navigation systems. They're all part of our cars, and so it is fun to think about how these have evolved over the last century, or I should say over our life in the past, and how they're going to affect us in the future. So this slide shows what people thought we were going to use, what the new technologies were going to be. And here are the technologies that I consider in the book. We look at new micro modes and autonomous vehicles and things like tunnel roads and hyperloops. So I'm going to go through this. The question, the issue that I address in my book, and we'll talk about now, is how these new technologies should be evaluated. How should we, what costs and benefits do they provide, and who is impacted? So what is the social equity? What is fair? And who should bear the costs and risks of these new technologies and services? And how should we integrate them into our transportation system? And to what degree should they be mandated, encouraged, regulated, restricted, or forbidden? And that's what the transportation planners, that's what we as transportation professionals really should be thinking about and preparing for. So let me just give a couple examples of the kind of problems or the kind of decisions that some of these new technologies and services raise. Let's think about electric cars. Electric cars are great. They are less polluting. than fossil fuel cars. And so there's quite a bit of emphasis in the planning world and the public policies to encourage their use. And to a large degree, those involve subsidies. They involve financial subsidies to purchase electric cars and the cost of building the recharging infrastructure. In many cases, there is some subsidy going into that, or a hidden subsidy by requiring new buildings to be to have the wiring. So it adds a little bit of cost to new buildings to put in the wiring to recharge cars in the garages. And also the fact that there is no fuel tax. There's a fuel tax on gasoline and diesel that you could say is a roadway user charge, but there's nothing equivalent on electric car fuel. And so, so there are a number of subsidies. And it is important to recognize that although electric cars produce no tailpipe emissions, there are significant emissions, what you call life cycle emissions from the production of the vehicles, especially the batteries, and the production of electricity. In many jurisdictions, it comes from fossil fuel. And so you could reasonably say in most situations, electric cars reduce emissions by 70%, but it's not quite true to call them zero emission vehicles. You could call them elsewhere emitting vehicles. So there's a big question: to what degree should we subsidize these, the electric vehicles, and what's the fair way to structure that? Another example is autonomous vehicles. Many of the benefits of autonomous vehicles require that they have a special dedicated lane so they can platoon. And so at what point is it efficient and fair to dedicate a highway lane, a public resource, a very valuable public resource like a highway lane, to autonomous vehicles so that they can operate more faster and more energy efficiently? Should we charge for the use of those lanes? And if so, how much? How should that price be structured? And what happens if one of those platoons crashes? What's the liability? So these are all questions that we as transportation professionals and the policymakers we advise are going to have decisions. So as a starting point, I like to go back and look at the history. During the last century, automobile transportation has accelerated. You could either say the speed that we travel, or you could say the distance that we travel, by an order of magnitude. So in 1900, there were virtually no cars, and people traveled primarily by walking and some bicycling and some public transit. But the distances that we traveled were pretty modest. Over the last century, we've accelerated quite a bit. And as a result, many costs also increased. The cost of the infrastructure. So we had to spend a huge amount on vehicles, on roadways, on parking facilities, so we can park all those vehicles, and also external costs like traffic congestion and accidents and air pollution all increased significantly. So depending on how you want to analyze this, you could, the details, we could argue over the details, but you can basically say that during the last century, our mobility increased by an order of magnitude, but so did the costs of that mobility. And so it's, I think it's really important. In my book and in my analysis, I emphasize that we, as the new technologies and services come into our lives, we want to make sure that we maximize the benefits and minimize the costs of these new innovations. And there are many ways to look at this, but you can certainly say that, using current technologies, that the costs, including infrastructure costs and user costs and external costs, are much, much smaller for some modes like walking and bicycling and e-bikes than they are for automobile transportation. Whether it's a gasoline car or an electric car, there's far greater cost to society. So those are that's kind of, those are some of the perspectives that I bring in, that I emphasize in my book. There's another way to think of this, and that is, if we evaluate travel speed, what we call effective speed, we're taking into account the travel distance divided by the time you spent traveling plus the time you spent earning money for your vehicle expenses. And when measured this way, for a low-income person, automobile transportation, or a low-income person often spends as much time earning money for their car as they do driving the car. And so from this perspective, in many cases, especially for lower income people, walking, bicycling, and public transit are actually faster, taking into account all the time they spend on their vehicles. So this emphasizes the importance of affordability. Okay, so let's go look at some of the new mobilities that are analyzed in my book, starting with active and micro modes. Micro modes include all those new types of scooters and electric devices that people are using. There's also shared vehicles, so the whole range of car sharing and bike sharing and scooter sharing. Ride hailing, which is a technology-based taxi services like Uber and Lyft. And so they have electronic dispatching, you use an app. Currently, ride hailing is somewhat less expensive than a conventional taxi services. And ride hailing companies are starting to provide shared services. So you have, Uber Pool and its variations. Those are very interesting, and they provide user benefits, and that's great. It's important to take into account all the costs and to figure out how we should incorporate them into our lives. One detail is that they greatly increase the value of curb access. So ride-hailing taxis, delivery vehicles, many of these new technologies use curbs to rely on vehicles being able to find a place to pick up and drop off passengers or goods. And so ride-hailing and taxi innovations, they increase the importance of or the emphasis on curb management. There's also many public transit improvements, many ways to improve public transit, everything from better navigation systems and payment systems and more ways to increase service frequency and comfort for the stations and the vehicles, ways to price them so they're more affordable, better integration with other modes, better marketing and promotion. Now, another set of the new technologies, transportation technologies and services include autonomous electric vehicles, or autonomous vehicles and electric vehicles, and then the variations, so potential autonomous buses and autonomous trucks. And I'll talk in more detail about these later on in my presentation, but let's first complete the overview. Another important category of new mobility technologies are telecommunications that substitutes for physical travel, what we call telework. And it's actually a mobility substitute. It reduces the amount of mobility that people need to engage in to access services. And we're doing it right now. This webinar is an example of using technologies to reduce the amount of physical travel. Now, there are benefits to telework, direct benefits to you and me for being able to do this, and benefits like reduced traffic congestion and air pollution. On the other hand, there's some significant problems and inequities. Not everybody has the technology, high-speed internet, and especially low-income people often have trouble participating using telework, or they might have the technology, but they have a crowded house, and so they might lack a quiet place to participate in in a webinar or telework. So these are all things that we need to consider in the planning. There's also some exciting new technologies, the things that engineers just love: tunnel roads, pneumatic tube transport like Hyperloops. These are the technologies that some people are really excited about. And then aviation innovations, air taxis, delivery drones, supersonic jets. There are a number of startup companies that are planning to offer these in the near future. So things like flying cars and supersonic jets and delivery drones. Those are all in the soon to be commercially available, or in the starting to be commercially available and potentially expanding a lot. Another area of new technologies and services are about how we manage our facilities, especially roadways. So what you could call mobility prioritization, road pricing, and HOV lanes and bus-only lanes, freight lanes, managing curves to favor or to ensure that higher value trips, like somebody picking up and dropping off packages or passengers, will always be able to find a parking space to facilitate that transaction. These are all strategies or technologies that can help us use the existing facilities more efficiently. They allow you to favor the higher value trips, like urgent errands or public transportation vehicles, buses and shared taxis, or freight vehicles. They allow those high priority trips to be given priority over the lower value mode. So those are technologies that we need to be thinking about as transportation professionals. And finally, there's freight logistics. Now, freight represents only about 10% of all vehicle travel, but it represents a much bigger share of fuel consumption, air pollution, you could say congestion and accident risk, and also road wear, and has particular impacts, so very large impacts in certain corridors. So you could say in a downtown area, freight delivery, freight vehicles can have very large impacts, and they're particularly high value trips. And so there's a great value, great importance to increasing the efficiency of freight and commercial deliveries. And if you want to impress people, you talk about logistics. This is all about logistics, and you can use the term logistical science if you want to sound very important. So improving logistical science or applying a logistical science is very important as part of our new technologies and services. So that's a quick overview of the new modes and technologies, or new modes and services, that are considered in my book. And in my book and in my analysis, I look at each of these considering various factors, like, what's its current state of deployment, and how will it affect travel, and what are the user costs, and what are the user convenience and comfort levels, crash risks and fairness and energy consumption, pollution emissions, how does it affect public fitness and health, and now, there's been this little pandemic. We could ask, how does it affect contagion, the risk of spreading diseases? And so ultimately we can ask for each of these new technologies and services to what role should it play in an efficient and equitable transportation system? So for each of these technologies, you can develop you could call it a market penetration or a deployment prediction curve. You could ask, what level of what's its ultimate maximum potential if it was fully deployed and it reaches saturation. And then you can ask, and so you call that market penetration, and you can ask how many years or decades would it take for a particular technology or service to reach that? And you can analyze that basically the vehicle fleet. The average vehicle lasts 15 to 20 years, and so it takes about 15 to 20 years if for the sales, the level of sales to reach the fleet penetration. That is, if we, for example, get 50% of vehicles, of new vehicles, to be electric by say 2030, it'll be 2045 or so before half of all vehicles in the fleet are electric. That's what these penetration curves represent. And for many of these technologies, we're really in the development or initial pilot stage. We're not seeing huge penetration in the market for a lot of these things. So let's, using electric autonomous vehicles as an example, let's look at some of the analysis I've done, and you could transfer this analysis to pretty much any of the other technologies and services. But okay, so let's say your car can drive itself, and you can fire your chauffeur, and you're gonna rely on the computer. Okay, what does that do for us? Well, it certainly reduces the stress of driving, especially if you have this stressful commute, say on congested roads. And compared with hiring a chauffeur or a taxi driver, it's much cheaper. Your computer is cheaper. And conceivably, a lot of commuters or a lot of people could get more work done. They're going to relax or do some work while they're traveling that they couldn't do if they're driving, and it provides independent mobility for non-drivers. Those are the benefits. But we can also ask, what are the costs, and how do the costs of the autonomous vehicles and autonomous taxis compare? In this graph, the yellow bars represent the estimated costs per kilometer of various modes. And if you buy your own autonomous car and you average it out, so the autonomous vehicles are going to cost somewhat more. They have more technologies, and they're going to require a higher level of maintenance and testing than non-autonomous vehicles. And so taking the typical cost, we're estimating they're probably going to cost about $7,000 a year in annualized cost if you average it, and you divide that by average mileage, and you end up with somewhere around that the autonomous car will cost somewhere around 30 cents a kilometer on average, and an autonomous taxi will cost a little bit more, somewhat more, because it requires things like cleaning and profits and other deployment dispatching. So the autonomous taxi will be quite a bit cheaper than a human-driven taxi or a ride-hailing service, but it's going to cost a lot more than owning your own car or owning your own self-driving car, your own autonomous car. And that's what this suggests, is that autonomous vehicles are still going to be, they're not going to be super cheap. And there'll be a lot of considerations if people have to choose between owning their own self-driving car or relying on autonomous taxis. Yes, people could save money by not owning their own car, by using shared vehicles, but especially in suburban and rural areas, there'll be a loss of convenience. If you have to wait for a self-driving taxi to get to your house, to pick you up or to deliver you, in a city, you can usually count on that vehicle being there in maybe 5 or at the most 10 minutes. But in a suburban or rural area, it could easily be much longer, twice that time, especially if you're you're needing a specialized vehicle, like let's say a big van to carry a family or sports gear. And so there'll be a number of factors to consider that. I suspect, and most, I think, experts that look at this suspect, is that autonomous taxis will be very efficient and attractive in dense urban areas, but in suburban and rural areas, people who can afford it will buy their own personal self-driving car. And because it's much more convenient and relatively cheap, especially if it's an electric car, it's going to stimulate more driving. A lot of people will use autonomous vehicles to choose a house that's even further away from their job and their services than they would currently consider.
Todd, it's Bruce here. You mind I just jump in? I just one question for you.
Yes, certainly.
Just if you go back to the chart you had with the costs there, I'm just wondering, with the autonomous vehicles, it seems whenever there's an accident, somewhere gets in the press, and it's doom and gloom, and these are such terrible vehicles. But they're probably less frequent accidents than the actual manually driven vehicles. So I'm just wondering what's the status at the moment? Are they considered to be safer vehicles, and how does that factor into the costs there for society?
That's a great and very timely question. And in fact, the slide I was just getting to deals with that. And
all right,
so what optimists say is, since 90% of all crashes are caused, at least in part, by human error, self-driving cars will eliminate 90% of crashes. It's going to be 90% safer. On the other hand, the technology is going to introduce a number of additional risks, including hardware and software failures, malicious hacking, increased risks from, or some other road users might feel too comfortable. They'll assume that since self-driving cars are perfectly safe, they can take more risk. The additional risk from platooning. So instead of having one car crash, if you've got, let's say, a dozen cars that are all operating within a meter or two of each other in a platoon, driving at, let's say, 60 to 100 kilometers an hour, if one of those vehicles fails, has a catastrophic failure, that could turn what would be previously, and with under current circumstances, would be a 1 or 2 car crash into a mass multi-vehicle crash. And also the technology might stimulate a lot more driving. And so even if the crash rate per kilometer or per billion kilometers is the same, the additional mileage or kilometerage will stimulate more crashes. And so it is important to consider these and to develop the policies that will, again, maximize the benefits or maximize the safety benefits and minimize the risks. We're at the early stage for autonomous vehicles, so it's unpredictable. We can't really say what these impacts are going to be. But let me ask you this. When's the last time your mobile phone failed to deliver what you were predicting? Well, mobile phones and the internet and computers, they do fail. We know that, and people use them, sometimes use them maliciously. And fortunately, that doesn't usually kill people. But if the computer system that's operating your car has that same kind of failure, let's say just a 1 second flicker in, the system is blocked for just a second or two, or a sensor, something fails on a sensor, that could be catastrophic. And so again, we don't know exactly what these are going to look like, but we do need to be, as planners, as policy and advising policymakers, we need to be clear on what some of these potential risks are and what's going to need to be done to minimize them. Similarly with traffic congestion, again, optimists predict that autonomous vehicles will reduce traffic congestion, but you ask them how. And usually it has something to do with dedicating lanes to these vehicles, giving them priority or a dedicated lane. Imagine this. Imagine I have a self-driving car and it drives me to work. And at my work site, let's say my job is located in a downtown area where commuters are expected to pay for parking. Parking is priced. I would rationally have my car drive home, or just circle the block continuously until I need it. The potential is there with current policies where urban parking is often priced, but roads are unpriced. Autonomous vehicles could easily double the amount of driving that a typical motorist engages in with all those empty backhauls or that vehicle circling the block waiting for the passenger to be picked up. If one person does that, not a big deal. But if we have a significant portion of the fleet is these autonomous vehicles it's very tempting to send them driving around empty for various reasons, stimulating a lot more vehicle traffic. That's a lot more congestion and road wear and traffic risk and air pollution. And so these are impacts that we need to be thinking about. And maybe, now there's some really good reasons to start applying road pricing and road space prioritization anyway. That's already important. But the autonomous vehicles, self-driving cars, they ratchet up the importance. They greatly increase the urgency of thinking about efficiently allocating road space. So in this graph, I take autonomous vehicles and I ask, okay, how soon will the vehicles be delivering various benefits? And my prediction is that during this decade, if autonomous vehicles become commercially available, so you could go down to the store and buy a self-driving car with what we call level 4 or level 5 capability, so it can drive on its own, some wealthier people will benefit from reduced stress and more independent mobility, and your public transit services, your buses could start taking advantage of them. But it'll take many more years before the technology is reliable and affordable, so that middle income and lower income people who often buy used vehicles will be able to use this technology for personal use. There may be those self-driving taxis may be able to provide some benefits for people who live in urban areas. But as I mentioned, in suburban and rural areas, they'll primarily be benefiting affluent people who can afford an expensive new car. One of the factors of analysis is to ask, to what degree does a new technology increase or reduce total vehicle travel? Because virtually any vehicle travel imposes some external costs. Congestion, road wear, parking requirements, accident risk, pollution, and impervious surface related costs from all that pavement. These are all related to, and in some cases they're directly related to the amount that people drive. So if a new technology increases total driving, it's probably going to exacerbate or increase some of those costs. Where if it helps people reduce per capita vehicle travel, it's probably providing some benefits. And so we want to think about how these will affect total travel. So in my book,
Todd, just before you jump on, I got a question here, if I can share it with you.
Sure.
Okay, so acknowledging these limitations you discussed for private autonomous vehicles, what role do you think autonomous ride pooling and flex route transit services will play in the future?
So let me check. I wasn't clear on that. What was the second part of the question?
What role do you think autonomous ride pooling and flex route transit services?
Exactly. As I'll discuss this a little bit more later on. But what many experts, what many proponents of, you could call efficiency, of maximizing the benefits, emphasize is that as these new technologies, as whether it's ride hailing or autonomous taxis, that our public policies should favor shared use. So should favor buses and shared taxis and shared what we call microtransit and autonomous taxis over personal use, over low you could call them low occupancy use, because it's simply more efficient. It uses road space and it uses fuel more efficiently. So let me a little bit later on, I'll show what some of the experts are emphasizing. But I just want to show that in my analysis, what I do is I identify 8 impacts to consider. I ask for each of the new technologies and services, does it increase travel speed or save travel time? Does it provide consumer or user savings and increase affordability, that is savings to lower income households? Does it reduce or increase congestion and road and parking infrastructure costs? Does it help achieve social equity goals like improving mobility for non-drivers and increasing affordability and reducing external costs? How does it affect health and safety? What are its contagion risks? How does it affect resource consumption and pollution emissions? To what degree does a new technology or service affect or help support or contradict strategic goals like more compact development versus sprawl? And so in my analysis, what I do is I give a rating to each of the new mobilities on a 7-point scale from -3 to +3 in terms of each of those goals or impacts. And then I'm able to rate the various mobilities in terms of to what degree do they support or contradict these various goals. And what this analysis shows is that the active and micro modes, so walking, bicycling, e-bikes, e-scooters, public transit improvements, and mobility prioritization, and mobility as a service, which is the packaging of all these together into one convenient package. Those tend to provide the most total benefits, or you could say help achieve the greatest range of community goals. Where some of the other new mobilities, especially the high-tech, energy-intensive or resource-intensive innovations, those have some negative impacts. Most of them are costly to use and require expensive infrastructure and impose external costs. This is not to say that they're bad, but it is to point out that they're costly and that they probably they are not supporting many of our strategic goals like affordability and increasing public health. They tend to be much more resource intensive. So resource intensive and and unaffordable. So I'm not against them. I'm not saying they have no place in a future transportation system, but what I find striking from my analysis is that the modes that seem most glamorous, the ones that a lot of people, especially technophiles, people that love new technology, the ones that they're most excited about are really not necessarily the ones that are going to improve our lives and communities the most. And an example I point out is think about, let's say, if you're picked up by a self-driving taxi and the previous occupant was a little bit messy and left let's say a tuna sandwich there, and the vehicle is smelly, or that Hyperloop that looks so exciting, so beautiful in the architectural renderings, but you ask yourself, what's it really like? What's it really going to be like to be locked into this capsule for 20 to 60 minutes with, let's say, a dozen other people, and it accelerates, and it has no windows. They can't have windows, and you've got to be locked in while it accelerates at a speed that will make, and decelerates at speeds that will make some people nauseous. and there won't be any service. You can't eat or drink because of those accelerations. So even though some of these technologies sound really exciting, let's keep in mind, let's ask ourselves, what's the actual experience? What is it really going to be like? And how attractive will that be? And who will benefit from those? So here are my conclusions very quickly. Vehicle innovations tend to be implemented more slowly than other technological change due to the high cost, strict safety requirements, and slow fleet turnover of motor vehicles. Automobiles typically cost 50 times as much and last 10 times as long as personal computers and mobile phones and digital cameras. Consumers seldom purchase a new vehicle simply to get a new technology. So the fact that it only took, let's say, a decade to go from your flip phone to your digital, smartphone, and it took a decade to go from film cameras to digital cameras, doesn't mean that it's going to take only a decade to go from everybody driving their own car to universal autonomous self-driving taxis and personal cars. It is likely to take quite a bit longer because of the high cost and slow turnover. Most vehicle innovations are initially costly and imperfect. Think about, for example, the first generation of automatic transmissions, or some of the problems with the early airbags. It usually takes decades before they are common and universal in the fleet. So automatic transmission technology was first available in the 1940s. I remember in the 1970s when an automatic transmission was still an expensive option in most cars, and it was only the 1980s or 90s before the technology was reliable and efficient and cheap enough that it became standard in most new cars. And even now, especially in Europe, a significant portion, 20 to 30% of new vehicles are standard manual transmission. Predictions that autonomous electric taxis will soon be cheap and ubiquitous and displace most private vehicle travel are mostly made by people with financial interests in the industry. And most objective analysis suggests that it'll take quite a bit longer. It'll be the 2040s, 2050s before autonomous vehicles are going to be cheap and affordable. There's considerable uncertainty concerning their benefits, costs, and travel impacts. Advocates often exaggerate the net benefits by ignoring some of the new costs and risks and rebound effects that additional vehicle travel and the harms that result from that additional vehicle travel that they can cause. And some new mobility support, but others contradict strategic goals such as social equity or improving public health or protecting the environment. Many potential benefits depend on how the new mobilities are implemented and regulated and priced. So there's a huge difference between, let's say, giving away road space for autonomous vehicle platooning or charging, and the price structure will have a significant impact on the take-up and how the benefits will be distributed. Many of the most glamorous new modes are not necessarily the most useful, beneficial, affordable, or fun. Total benefits tend to be greatest for the affordable, resource-efficient modes. Expensive, resource-intensive modes tend to provide smaller benefits, greater costs and risks, and less equity. So many organizations are now, many professional organizations now are beginning to talk about how we should implement the policies and regulations that should apply. One organization that I particularly like, that I've worked with and support, is called Shared Mobility Principles for Livable Cities, and it talks about these issues, how public policies should respond. There's also some really good publications that have come out recently that are looking at how governments, how particular jurisdictions should prepare for the new mobilities. Everything from, should we subsidize electric vehicles? Should we require that ride-hailing services use hybrid or electric vehicles to reduce pollution? How should we manage road space and curbs? And what price should be applied to some of these things? So the Seattle's new mobility playbook is one example. There are several others. Los Angeles and Denver, Colorado have also done good work. I think Vancouver is embarking on some of this analysis. And let me assure you, this is job security for all you good transportation professionals out there. If you can become the local expert on how to integrate new mobilities into our transportation system and deal with things like curb management and roadway management, there is going to be a lot of work for some of us to continue on this. Now, that's my slideshow. That's my presentation. If you want more information, visit our VTPI website, Victoria Transport Policy Institute website, where you'll find various reports that go into a lot of detail about what I just presented. They're available free, or buy my book, New Mobilities. So we have about 15 minutes. I'm looking forward to getting more discussion with those of you in the audience.
Okay, that's great. Thanks, Todd, for all of that. And for those of you on the call, we've got the chat box open, so you can put a question in there. We'll go through those first, and perhaps we can open the lines if people aren't great typers, and you can just voice your question to Todd. But in the meantime, Todd, I do have another one for you, just on the the different types of vehicles that are out there with the hybrids, fuel cell, electric, hydrogen, and so forth. Is there any word on where the major trend is going now? It seems like the hydrogen cars have pretty much fallen off the radar. I don't hear much about them. And so that's the first question. The second one is, it seems Tesla's they seem to be everywhere, maybe the Nissan Leafs and so forth. Where are we heading with the environmental impact of these cars that get to the end of their 15-year lifespan, and the batteries that are going to have to be, I don't know, recycled, disposed of,
Sure.
getting resources to build the batteries and so forth? Just if you have any thoughts on that.
Sure. Well, those are all great questions. So let me, and there are issues that I certainly struggle with. I am not a technologist, and so I look at these from a policy perspective, not an emerging technology. I don't pretend to, for example, be able to predict or analyze the technical benefits or advantages of, let's say, hydrogen powered engines versus electric cars, electric vehicles. And what I do look at is when these do, when somebody does a comparison, when we do come up with the costs and the benefits and the risks, I think we should plug those into our analyses. Now, from what I see, electric cars, battery electric cars seem to be winning the technological battle. I don't know, maybe there's going to be a surprise from the hydrogen world. Some of the issues are basically the same. In order to produce the hydrogen or produce the electricity, you need some energy source. And so if that is fossil fuel, either of those is ultimately not very, or does produce some climate emissions. If they are if they are renewable resources that generate the hydrogen or the electricity, you've got a cleaner vehicle. So there's that. I must admit, I like electric car, the quiet of the electric cars and the simplicity, and I'm not sure how hydrogen vehicles compare. So I'm perfectly, I'm not predicting which technology is going to go. I'm identifying the framework that we should use when we're evaluating these. Now, I would point out that currently, it is very exciting to see electric car technology make huge advancements over the last decade. And much as I disagree with some of his other efforts, I do respect Elon Musk's development of batteries and making electric cars really cool and exciting. Okay, that's great. On the other hand, electric cars still only represent about 3 or 4% of new vehicle sales. It's somewhat more in cities, but taking into account all vehicles, and especially emphasizing that although there are about 24 electric cars available on the market now, there's only 1 or 2 electric trucks and vans on the market now. So the larger vehicles that are more energy intensive and more space intensive are slower to electrify than the small cars that are already energy efficient. So my prediction is, optimistically, half of all vehicles sold will be electric by 2030. That's a really fast deployment. But even then, that means that it'd be 2045 or 2050 before the majority of cars in the fleet, or the vehicles in the fleet, are fully electric. So, you know, I'm a great supporter of electric vehicle deployment. There are definitely benefits, but I think we need to be cautious about overestimating those benefits. Ignoring, or let's say to accelerate vehicle fleet electrification, we will need some policies so that otherwise fully functional vehicles are scrapped prematurely simply to accelerate that deployment. And that's a costly, you know, we have to ask, how well are we prepared for a fleet turnover scrappage program? Similarly, with autonomous vehicles, it's probably going to take quite a long time before the technology is fully developed, commercially available, regulators approved, and then for it to be deployed through the fleet. So we're talking decades.
Sure. Okay. Yeah. So I've got some other questions here, and for all the good work Elon's doing with electric cars, I'd suggest he's undoing it by sending his spaceships into lower orbit just for the sake of entertaining passengers. But anyway, we'll save that for another day. Troy's asked a question here about road authorities. Is there any you know, 1 or 2 key items you think that should be considered to land use development guidelines and so forth to accommodate some of these trends you're talking about? Sure.
Well, if you read the my Globe and Mail editorial just last week, I'll add a link to it in the chat box. But I am a great supporter of road pricing and smart growth because they make our transportation system more efficient. So you know, I think that's an important point. And the risks now are with these new technologies, some of these risks are much greater. The risks.
If you want, Todd, we can send the link out to the attendees afterwards.
Yeah, let me. Exactly. That's distracting. Sorry, I apologize. The point is, we already have reasons to more efficiently price roads and parking facilities, and to prioritize freight vehicles and public transportation. And to more efficiently manage curb space to favor, let's say, pickup and drop off. Those are already justified on just on efficiency and fairness grounds. But then you have all this potential additional traffic when people are having their self-driving cars drive them to work and then drive home or circle the block. That could be catastrophic, or could severely exacerbate traffic congestion and roadway costs and things like that. So So it is going to be really important for transportation professionals and public policy makers to understand these risks. We need to frighten people and to convince them, to convince decision makers and the general public that it is critical to anticipate all of the potential risks of these new technologies, and to put into place these policies such as those recommended by the shared mobility for livable communities. So there is some thinking about this, but I don't think the message is, I don't think the discussion is fully, that most people quite understand. I think we're still overly excited about these shiny new technologies, flying cars and self-driving, flying air taxis and self-driving cars, that there has not been the degree of critical analysis. One other, I noticed one other, while I'm at it, one of the other questions that came up is about contagion risk. What I actually wrote another report, and in fact discussed it in one of the previous CITE webinars. My report is called Pandemic Resilient Community Planning, and it asks this question: to what degree does public transit and transit-oriented development increase or reduce contagion risk? And what the research actually shows pretty consistently is that public transit is actually pretty low risk. It's not, under most circumstances, there's enough airflow, and especially if passengers are wearing masks, that public transit does not seem to be a high risk. People fear it, but the high contagion, there are higher rates of contagion in suburban automobile dependent areas, because it turns out, yes, driving alone in your car has low contagion risk, but most motorists actually do have to carry passengers, at least occasionally, and they're sharing their vehicles. And if you live in an automobile dependent area, you're doing a lot of those kind of trips. And so it actually turned out automobile dependent areas have higher total contagion risk. Now, that's not to deny that there are some risks associated in public transit, and more importantly, there's the fear of public transit being a high contagion risk. So those are things that we need to address in our transportation planning. But my conclusion is that it's not that there isn't a legitimate major reason to fear public transportation as a vector for infectious diseases.
Okay, well, that's great. Thanks for all of that, Todd. There are some other questions that Monique put in. You know, she can stay on the line if you wanted to hear the answer. Todd can get to those, but I know we're coming up to the top of the hour, so we were due to wrap up at 1 o'clock. I'll just take this opportunity to say thanks to Todd for the presentation, and also in 2 weeks' time we'll be putting on another webinar with the guest being Titan Environmental Containment, and they're going to talk about geosynthetics, geomembranes, and so forth. That we can use in our road designs if we're building roads or designing roads over porous soils, and for retaining walls, behind retaining walls for slope stability and so forth. So for those that are interested, keep an eye out for that. That'll be coming through from CITE as another free webinar, if I'm not mistaken, Stephen. I think these are going in the free format these days. So thank you everyone for attending. Thank you, Todd. We'll finish a minute early, but if anybody wants to stay on, and Todd, if you have a few minutes to take these extra questions, I'll hang on as well, and we'll just carry on for a little bit longer to see if we can get some answers out. For everyone else, thanks for calling in.
Thank you all, and yes, I'm happy to stay a little bit longer. Send me your questions in the chat box, or if for some reason we can't connect, send an email to litman@vtpi.org, and I'll be glad to discuss anything in the future.
And that's on the screen there. So I think, I don't know if Monique looks like she's still here. So she had a couple of questions. Todd, if you wanted to have a look in the chat line there, you can see she's got a few questions. That the second one's a bit shorter, so I'll just put that to you about carbon footprint. And I was asking, you know, about the 15-year, what happens with the batteries. So And
Yeah.
he's asking the same question. Is it altruistic to say I drive an electric vehicle, therefore I'm environmentally friendly, or is that just a
Right.
smoke screen?
So in my analysis, I use what we call life cycle emissions that take into account what we call the embedded emissions. That is the pollution that was produced in producing the vehicle. And so when you do that, hold on just a second, I will return us to this slide that shows one estimate of these life cycle emissions. So this shows the emissions from the tailpipe, from the battery, from the vehicle production, from the fuel production for typical, and this happened to be European, so, or it did a lot of the analysis for European cars. But what it shows is that yes, electric vehicles do reduce emissions by, let's say 50 to 70%, depending on how the electricity is generated. But it's not 100%. There's still significant emissions, a lot of it from the embedded vehicle and battery production. And so it's not quite accurate to call them zero emission. I'm a great supporter of vehicle electrification, but I'm an even greater supporter of efforts to reduce total vehicle travel as an emission reduction strategy. And what was the other question?
Yeah, so it's about the incentive for vehicles to actually make the change in technology. Now that the companies are more engaged in making those changes, how do you see that affecting the progression of the change? How quickly? Like I think Volkswagen's going to go all electric. I don't know what year is it, 2025 or something?
Right.
If I may elaborate, Todd, I don't know if you remember years ago, Transport Canada was doing a series of workshops across the country, and the car dealers were attending every one of them and strongly opposed to developing the electric vehicle technology. And they probably would stay opposed, except people like Tesla comes along and says, well, if you're not going to do it, I am. And so are they going to keep resisting? And because they have a lot to lose with the loss of the combustible engine and the maintenance.
Well,
can I throw one other thing in there too, Todd? Throw into it, these American manufacturers, Ford and Chevrolet and whatnot, and then the political climate with if you're Republican or Democrat and which government's in power and how that affects their change, mood to change.
Sure. I mean, what you raise may have been true a decade ago. Now it seems like most vehicle manufacturers are developing their electric vehicle models. And so I'm not sure that dynamic is significant anymore. I do see that the most motorists, most people who are considering buying a car now seem ready to buy an electric, provided it has the performance, that the price is comparable and the performance is good. So there's a lot of attention now to battery duration and reducing the cost. The cost is pretty high. There is currently a price premium. An electric car is somewhat more expensive because of those very expensive batteries. The batteries end up being a third of the cost of those cars now. There are reasons to think that the battery prices, the cost of those batteries might come down. So most experts seem to be predicting that in the next few years, electric cars will be as price-wise as attractive as a fossil fuel car, and their performance will be reasonable. So even though there certainly could be some manufacturers that will continue to resist electrification, my interest I think that we're beyond that point, and my interest is not who should we blame. You know, should we blame manufacturers? My interest is what are the appropriate public policies that support the broadest range of community goals. Things like affordability, public health and safety, reducing public infrastructure costs. Those are the issues that I'm focusing on in my book.
Okay, so hopefully that give you some information there, Monique. So Todd, we're at 1:05, so I think that's good. We're down to just the last few people that wanted to hear the end conversation there. So thanks, Kathy, Monique, and Ray for sticking with it, hanging with us to get the last answer out there. Thanks for attending, and Todd, thanks for the presentation.
And Bruce, thank you for moderating and for supporting this and for being the president of the Vancouver Island section of the Institute of Transportation Engineers. So well done, Bruce.
Yeah, always a good role.